welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a really lovely and sweet and sad romance. Hello, and welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Of course, yes. My name is Richard Roper, and I am the author of This Disaster Loves You.
I would love for you to tell our readers a little bit about your journey toward this book. I know that it's not your first, but if you could just tell us a little bit about, your writing journey and how you got here.
Of course, yeah. So this is my third book, and it was really a book born out of out of lockdown and the pandemic, where I was looking for a new idea and I hadn't quite landed on anything, partly I think because I was just like all of us, stuck in my flat here in London, and I was slightly starved of ideas. And then my girlfriend and I went on our first sort of trip when lockdown had finished, and we got on a train and we went up to York in the north of England, and we were staying in a hotel, and it was just so nice to be out having a bit of an adventure and doing something different and not just staring at the same old four walls. And we were staying in this hotel, which was a very nice hotel, and we were down having breakfast one morning, and the owner of the hotel, who was a slightly sort of beleaguered, melancholy chap in his 50s, was doing the best he could, despite the fact there wasn't really anyone helping him. And I overheard a conversation where someone was complaining very loudly to him about their stay in the hotel. And I just knew that there was something kind of incredibly unfair about the fact that, we were just out of lockdown. People were just starting to kind of get out there and do stuff. And lo and behold, this person had already found something to complain about. And then I kind of got slightly obsessed with this person and what had brought them to this point where both people really, this poor person trying to run this place and someone who almost enjoyed, I think, complaining. And so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole where I found myself on TripAdvisor and Google reviews and loads of other places, and found myself reading lots of sort of negative reviews of places, just to sort of, and found myself just completely bowled over by how much effort people took, being very kind of rude about places. And I must say, I would recommend it if you're ever feeling like you just want a 5-minute break from reality. If you go on and look at TripAdvisor reviews of somewhere like the Eiffel Tower and sort by worst to best, you will just see the absolute sort of madness of humanity. So from that, on the train back from York, I just couldn't stop thinking about this poor man and his hotel and his livelihood. And then that eventually spiraled into something where I found myself sort of feverishly writing down an idea for a book that involved a man running his own pub on the coast of England, and sort of trying to figure things out from there.
That's a really interesting origin story, because one of the things that I did really like about it is the depiction of sort of pub culture, which I only really briefly encountered on a very short trip once, but was something that I remained really fascinated with. And that leads me to a question about world building, because I think we tend to talk about world building in like fantasy or sci-fi when you are building worlds that don't exist, but you're doing that too when you are writing like the worlds in which we inhabit, So could you talk about maybe did your depiction come out of like your own experience of pubs or like people that you observed? Because I also like the social ecosystem is really nicely depicted.
Sure, yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about world building. As you say, it's kind of a phrase that we use when we're talking about fantasy or sort of but particularly with this book, I am a big fan of the British pub. I spend sort of a lot of time writing in pubs and meeting friends there, and I feel like it's one of the few things we kind of get right in Britain. I feel like whenever I kind of go abroad, I feel like, well, why, our food generally isn't as good as this, but the British pub as a sort of institution is kind of, if you find your ideal pub, particularly in the winter, and there's a roaring fire, and some of these places are hundreds of years old. There is something sort of quite magical about them, and I think they are places where quite often, I think in a very male way, actually, men of a certain age in particular who haven't necessarily got a community around them or family sort of tend to find themselves in these places, even if they're not necessarily striking up conversation with people or meeting friends there. I think there is a sense of kind of community where you're on your own, but you're with other people. And so, and pubs, I think, are a great place to observe sort of all of life, and you get all sorts of people in there from different walks of life. And so from that point of view, that kind of came quite naturally to me, I think, hopefully being quite sort of authentic with it. And obviously as well, just gave me an excuse to go to the pub quite a lot to research in inverted commas. So that was quite a fun part of the process.
That's a great reason to write a book about a pub, just to give yourself an excuse to spend more time in them.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the proprietors of this pub, Brian and Lily. You tell the story of their relationship in a dual timeline. Could you talk a little bit about your decision to use this structure, and then sort of like, what do you do to make sure that the stories are keeping pace with each other? Do you do a lot of moving around? Is there a lot of editing in that for you, or?
Sure, yeah. I mean, when I first wrote I like to plan my books before I write them. Not sort of, I don't know what's going to happen in every scene, but I sort of know what the basic structure is, and I know largely where everything's going. But I was looking back at my synopsis that I'd written before I started actually writing the book the other day, and I'd realized that the dual timeline, when I approached it initially, there was going to be a dual timeline, but what was set in the past was going to be secondary to what happens in the present, which is that Brian is trying to find Lily after she disappeared 7 years ago, just leaving him a note saying that she was going away and she wasn't sure when she was going to come back. And so after this little discovery on TripAdvisor, where he feels convinced that he's found out that she is still around and that he might even be able to find her, he sort of, in the present day, we see him rushing around the country trying to find her, and to ask her what happened. And then when it came to the writing of it, I realized that, of course, she had a reason for leaving, and that was going to sort of drive the heart of the book in the narrative that's set in the past. And so that was the part I had to really spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think when I come to writing a new book, I'm strong on plot. Like I feel like I'm always quite clear on what's going to happen and where the characters will be on the first page and the last page. But the thing that I find I can only really get to by the actual process of writing is to find out the sort of, what is this book really about? It's not just about this man on this mission to find his wife. We need to sort of there needs to be a sort of a real heart to this story and a big theme. And so that was that kind of came sort of secondarily to that first narrative. And so it took me a long while to figure out what that was. And that was actually I spent a lot of time working with my brilliant editor Tara, who really helped me kind of draw out those strands. And it would have been on a third or fourth draft where I really kind of figured out what was happening. And as you say, the balance of those scenes and making sure the pacing was up. And I think what helped with that in a way was that in the present day narrative, there is this quest that's going on. So Brian is actively, with every chapter I knew I needed to get him closer on his mission. And so that gave me a little bit of license to linger a little more in the past in a subsequent chapter where I could, use that just to show the sort of slow burn of a relationship and then sort of what happens when they're in that relationship and what leads to things going wrong when Lily leaves the pub.
Yeah, I think it works really well to sort of keep the reader invested, but also to sort of like portray Brian's mindset throughout the present, because it sort of functions the way that memory does, like things are triggered by what happens to you in the present and you recall things. And he is like a very interior character. So that brings me to a question about him. Brian is, I think, he's intensely likable to me anyway. I identify with some parts of him. But his head isn't always a really extremely pleasant place to dwell, like especially for him of all people. So can you talk about, crafting this interiority and how you do that to play with, reader sympathy and also maybe like a lack thereof, how like that tug and give between like likability and unlikability?
Yeah, that it's something that I think again comes sort of in a later on in maybe sort of draft 2 or 3, where maybe in that first draft that I would say it probably errs more on the side of, this is what a sort of quote unquote person in real life would think about the world. And then there is that always that balance between wanting to be honest with a character and their motivations and what they think about the world and what they think about people, and then making sure that that for someone who's picked up this book, they want to, and they, as you say, there is a lot of being in Brian's head. As a writer, I don't want that to be an unpleasant experience, because no one really likes spending time in someone's company where you don't get on with them. So that is definitely a balance, and I think again that's having an editor really really helps, because it's someone to sort of say, you need to shift the balance in a slightly different way. I mean, I'm always very keen that a character isn't likable for the sake of being likable or to sort of compromise. But certainly, I think giving a window into why a character does something where it isn't the most logical choice, or it's not the most sort of likable decision, that kind of helps to be able to give them that headspace to sort of help them kind of explain to the reader why they are the way they are. But again, yeah, as I say, that's having an editor is a godsend in that sense, because she will, and my editor does not hold back from saying he is not likable at this moment. You need to, give the reader something to cling on to here. So it's always, an interesting process.
Nice. Yeah, I have a question about editing actually, because you have also done some editing and proofreading. Do you learn different things from editing other people's work than you do from being edited?
I don't know if I learned different things. I think I mean, it's being an editor as part of my day job when I'm not writing is a really useful skill. I think it's certainly helped me. Well, when I'm being edited, uh, I'd love to say that at this point, now I'm 3 books in, that I receive feedback well, and I do eventually, but at first it's just like being criticized. I can't see the wood for the trees. All I see, I ignore all the very lovely comments, and all I see is, what I need to do, what I need to change, and I should give up. I feel like I must give up. I'm just, it's the worst. And obviously I'm sort of now long in the tooth enough to know that will last for about 2 hours, and then I'll stop feeling sorry for myself, and then I'll get on with the hard work. But it has meant that I'm much more aware now when I'm editing someone that I will never be dishonest in my feedback, but I will err on the side of sugarcoating feedback so that it's honest and someone knows what I have to change, but that it doesn't come across as if they've done something wrong. So that's one part of it. And then I think, when I'm writing, I know that I sometimes fall into the same traps of people who I'm editing. So it's, in a way, it's a good way of reminding myself, if I figure out if I'm editing a book that someone's written and I'm sort of thinking that needs something to change with, pacing, or someone has gone down a slight, they're using a couple of cliches when they shouldn't, then that's a good reminder myself that, that I'm almost certainly falling into those traps as well. So it's sort of an ongoing process, I think.
Hmm. I'd love if we could talk a little bit about Brian and Lily's dynamic and maybe like how that manifests in their dialogue. Because one thing that I do really appreciate about it is that it does a really good job of illustrating the way that like the the way that couples speak to each other changes over the course of a relationship. And
Mhm.
so how do you conceive of that? Like when you are looking at like how their gosh, like how their relationship affects the way they talk to each other. Mhm.
Yeah, I think that because we see their relationship from beginning to end in many ways, and I think that that couples do, I think, speak differently at different points in a relationship. And I think, in a way, um, if it's a relationship with a beginning and an end, the beginning and the end are actually quite similar because, to a certain extent, you're saying one thing while you think the other. Particularly, if you are courting someone and you spend so much time uh, trying to say the right thing or trying to say interesting things or trying to say the thing that you think the other person will want to hear, or you're trying to make them laugh, that to a certain extent you're not being your kind of authentic self. It's a bit of a dance. And then when you get more used to each other, and the sort of some of those kind of barriers fall away, and you're just being completely honest. And then, of course, at that point, you're more likely to be vulnerable with each other, and often, say things that are deeply hurtful. Because I think there is a line in the book where Brian thinks, that's the problem, when you love someone, you know how to hurt them. So, and then when, at the end of a relationship, if things are sort of beginning to fall apart, again, you're overthinking things, or you're not really being authentic, or maybe there's an imbalance where someone wants to be honest and the other person doesn't. So I think it's as I say, there are sorts of similarities at certain points, and that's hopefully what I've been able to try and reflect in the book, and with Lily and Brian.
Hmm. Yeah, it does. It does feel cyclical in a way, the way that we do share sort of more in the middle. And I think it speaks to, also how that dynamic contributes then to the end, or can hasten it. Um, I'd also love to talk about their dynamic in terms of like, I guess their personality traits, because like Brian's a little bit more internal, introverted, tends toward the depressive, and Lily, brings him out of that at various points in their relationship. So yeah, can you talk about also because sometimes the things that initially draw a couple to each other can also be the things that then get in the way at the end. Can you talk about how you were thinking about that maybe, or
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think that as you say, they are different people. And when we first meet them, Lily is someone who is very assured, and she's grown up in London and has a big group of friends, and is confident and sort of quite sophisticated. And Brian is someone who had a slightly unusual upbringing, and has only recently moved to the city, and is what is clearly sort of anxious about the world and his place in it. And at first, Lily sort of helps to kind of bring Brian out of his shell a little bit. And I was sort of quite careful that that didn't fall into a sort of manic pixie dream girl type affair, which is always the sort of, it's, I think everyone is, to some extent drawn to that kind of dynamic, but it's been done to death, and also it's sort of not very realistic. But there are shades of, someone who is a bit sparky and wants to live life to the full, and then someone who is more reticent and reserved. So I think, at the start of the relationship, it's kind of wonderful because Lily draws Brian out, and sort of he gets to sort of feel, I think, confident in himself for the first time. And from that point on, he is more assured. But I think as things start to become strained here and there, and they really go through the ringer when it comes to various things they're going through. He sort of slightly goes back to that initial state and becomes more reserved and withdrawn, and that's when things start to become difficult because, of course, he can't just rely on this person to to bring him back out of his shell again. So that's where kind of, some of the tension plays out as the story goes along.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really lovely. And something I love is that while it does tell a more traditional love story in the flashback segments, like the main bit of the text, like really picks up where most romances leave off, So
Yeah.
it's like it really covers the whole range of a human relationship. I said that like I'm a robot, but like of a relationship between people. Yeah, it's so lovely. And just thank you for coming to our show to share with our listeners and readers.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Very welcome. Okay, listeners, it's your turn. You're going to check out This Disaster Loves You. By the time that you are listening to this, it will be available out in the world. So head over to your favorite library, independent bookstore, wherever you like to go for books. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.